ladies and gentlemen. My name is Victoria Pagan, and I'm from the Department of Classics here at the University of Florida. And several of us in the audience have just come from the annual awards program in our Department of Classics and Center for Greek Studies, where it's been our tradition to invite an alumnus, or in this case, an alumna, to come back to campus and tell us what they've been doing since graduating with a degree in classics. Over the last few years, we've heard from high school Latin teachers, a political research analyst, and today we heard from a pharmacist. That, my friends, is the work of the humanities. We teach our students a battery of transferable skills, attention to detail, problem solving, communication, teamwork, sense of self, and thanks to Sophia, I'm reminded to add to the list cultural competence, and these make them valuable assets in the marketplace. But in the humanities, we're training people to do more than make a living. Our goal is a meaningful life, a good life. And we're grateful then to the Center for the Humanities and Public Sphere for organizing this year's speaker series around the topic of work. So please welcome Bonnie Efros, the director of the Center for the Humanities and Public Sphere.
Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I know this is about the busiest time in the semester that there is, but we're very excited this evening to have the last talk in our series, The Work of the Humanities, Critical Thinking in Life and Labor. As many of you who have attended talks in this series leading up to tonight, you've seen the way that our speakers have used the humanities, often paired with other disciplines outside the humanities, to explore the changing workplace and the effect of technology in our lives. This evening, our invited speaker will tackle a very large and complex issue which has to do with our democratic tradition. Namely, how should we understand fundamental changes in our day-to-day lives as a consequence of things like data collection, global communication via the internet, and the rapidly shifting environment of digital technology? There's no doubt that a complicated mix of these developments have both posed challenges as well as offered new opportunities for civic engagement, whether one runs for political office or one simply filling out a petition online, for instance. Using her deep understanding of ancient Athenian democratic theory and practice, Dr. Farrar will suggest this evening how the discipline of classics offers an abundant well from which to draw ideas and inspiration as we encounter both new obstacles and long-time obstacles to participating as full partners in American democracy. As our earlier speakers in the series, she'll demonstrate the valuable resources that are offered by humanities disciplines and how they help us make sense of our rapidly changing culture of innovation and the associated uncertainty that it brings in our lives. But before doing so, I have a long list of thank yous to make, and I hope that you'll bear with me because many people and centers have made this evening possible. I'd, of course, like to give my thanks to Dr. Sophia Akerd and Sean Adams, who is now chair of the history department, for having conceptualized this series, chosen and invited speakers, and made all the events that you see possible this evening. I'd also like to thank Tim Blanton and Sarah Harms from the Humanities Center, the staff of the Graham Center who've made, as well as Class Shared Services who've made our events possible for the series. Our series is sponsored by the Rothman Endowment, the Yavits Fund at the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. It's also, we've had co-sponsorship from a large number of partners, including the UF Informatics Institute, Smathers Libraries, the Honors Program, the College of Public Health and Health Professions, the Department of Political Science, the Department of English, the Marston Milbauer Eminent Scholar Chair, the Department of Philosophy, Department of Classics, the William B. and William F. Poe Center for Business Ethics, Education, and Research, the Albert Brick Chair, the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, UF Research Computing, and the Graham Center, and who've all made this successful series possible. We've placed flyers near the door if anybody's interested in signing up also on our mailing list for future events. And after our talk this evening, there will be a question and answer period, and we'll ask you to either come up to the microphone here, or we'll come to you with a microphone so that this will all be captured by our recording this evening. So without further ado, it's always a pleasure to see events like this evening's come to fruition after long planning. And I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Cynthia Farrar, who's both a scholar and a civic entrepreneur. She holds her PhD from Cambridge University, and she works as a research scholar at Yale's Institution for Social and Policy Studies. She's the author of The Origins of Democratic Thinking, The Invention of Politics in Classical Athens, and more recently, from 2001 to 2007, she orchestrated nonpartisan conversations among randomly invited citizens with local partners and the McNeil-Lehrer Productions. In 2007, Dr. Farrar, oops, I'm having just a couple founded an organization known as Purple States, which is a video production company that brings the experiences and perspectives of ordinary people into the discussions of politics, policies, and programs that affect them. Purple States documentary video series have aired, among other places, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. So without further ado, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Cynthia Farrar, who will speak this evening on Startup Democracy, Innovating Citizenship with the Ancient Athenians.
Thank you so much. I'm small, and I'm conscious that wherever I stand, I'm not going to be visible. So maybe I should stand here. Does that work? Yeah? Okay. I may also pace. I have a bad habit of doing that. So I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Sophia and Sean, for enticing me down here. I've already had a number of encounters that make me realize just how fertile a place this is, both intellectually and in thinking about how what you do as scholars has an impact on the world around you. So I feel right at home, except that really warm, which is awfully nice. So our story about innovating citizenship starts not in ancient Athens, but in Silicon Valley, the leading edge of our upstart culture, where once a year the tech glitterati gather for their equivalent of the Oscars, the Crunchies. A year ago at the Crunchies, after awarding themselves prizes for technological innovation and business success, they turned to another aspect of their entrepreneurial impact. Together, they said, they had managed to bring the unemployment rate in San Francisco down by half. And they were starting to channel their resources to try to benefit the people who were being left behind, at least so far, by this economic boom. As one of the leaders of that effort said, however, when she got up, she said, you know, people talk about the tech industry as if we're really insular. But I know, she said to her audience, I know all of you out there are saying that's not my story. I care, I give, I volunteer. So why are the techies defensive? Well, outside on that February night was another ceremony, a mock ceremony, a mocking ceremony called the Crappies, where threatened residents of San Francisco gathered to, as they said, give crap to the tech industry. These people were not homeless. Maybe some of them were, but they were not only homeless or people struggling with addiction. These were people who were finding it increasingly difficult to live in San Francisco. Skyrocketing rents, the whole impact of gentrification, evictions, and so on. For them, that was the impact of the tech industry. And so they handed out, among other awards, one for tax evasion. And the representative for that evening of Twitter got up, graciously accepted the award, and said, so, whose town is this anyway? It's our town. We bought it. We own. Is this now not working? Still working? We own it. The residents who were gathered here outside the Crunchies were challenging what they saw as a sense of entitlement on the part of the tech industry because they have resources to decide what happened to San Francisco. But the question that these folks raised was not how are we going to collectively address our problem as residents of San Francisco, but rather whose town is it? So we're going to talk about what do we do to address conflicts like this. Notice, though, as Nathan Heller, who wrote a wonderful profile of this encounter and the situation for the New Yorker a year ago, observed, they're not appealing to some shared problem-solving framework within which they would each articulate their particular perspective and stake, and then they'd work it out. Or in my terms, they're not appealing to a citizenship framework at all. In fact, both sides of the barricades here reflect a set of assumptions that I think is emblematic of our increasingly upstart culture. Namely, that direct initiative, the expression of our personal talents and resources, and bringing them to bear on what we think ought to happen, that's what's going to add a forward for us individually, for the economy, for society. We can translate our personal qualities, concerns, perspectives into what we need to do collectively, and we don't want to use, and we increasingly don't trust mediating structures of any kind. So maybe we're beyond citizenship. Maybe, as some people have said with respect to the internet, maybe we now can achieve direct democracy. Maybe we don't need that kind of negotiation. We can just do this without benefit of politics. Or maybe these political frameworks are gradually being eroded. The Economist encapsulated this very neatly, I thought, in a piece called, I think, What's the Matter with Democracy? Where they said that there are 3 levels of threat to our political frameworks from above. Globalization. So increasingly we're oriented as consumers or vendors or suppliers, producers to a world market. And that's how we shape our activities and our sense of what ought to happen. Cutting right through political frameworks. Erosion from below. The proliferation of nonprofits and the internet itself, which facilitates our ability to identify our particular interests and concerns and join forces with others who share them and express and pursue those. Again, without having to work through existing mediating frameworks. Erosion from within. Platonic point for you classicists here, which is that our politicians, partly because they see their authority being attenuated, are increasingly appealing to us as consumers, as bundles of given interests and desires, and trying to jockey to persuade us that they are best positioned to help us those, not appealing to us as citizens who need to think about how our concerns and desires relate to those others in our community. If that's true, if we're beyond citizenship in either of these ways, well, we don't need it anymore, or we can't have it even if we wanted it. What am I doing here? Why am I here talking about citizenship? This is a great illustration from Nathan Heller's piece in the New Yorker of the hippies and the techies going at it. So what am I doing here? I'm here to alienate you. I'm here to try to make things strange for a while, to detach us from all of us, because we all need reminding all the time, including me, that we cannot just translate the personal to the collective. It's not democracy, and it's not viable. We are social animals. We live with others. And even if that grouping is just a tribe, a clan, some extension of us, our kin, still we continually have to be thinking about how we feel or think or what we want, how does it relate to what others want. It's not a direct translation. It's a reflective and iterative process. Okay? But this becomes particularly acute, this need for this framework, this tension between us as individuals and us as members of a community as soon as we're committed to democracy. Because democracies are premised on the idea that in a diverse society that includes a range of different people of different backgrounds and characteristics and virtues and talents and resources, that each and every one of us has some equal claim to deciding what happens to us collectively. As soon as you do that, you make it impossible to translate directly from what to feel now or what we can do with our resources, what we can lay claim to us all collectively. And we're also saying, but we also to attend to the individual interests, at least register them, of everybody in our community. The way Plato put it is that democracy distributes a kind of equality to equals and unequals alike. This seemed to him a knockout argument that democracy was crazy. I mean, how can you do that? Well, this is political equality we're talking about. It's constructed equality. So a number of months ago, I'm sure you know, the director of the FBI gave a remarkable speech about the way we get on or don't. And in it, he quoted Martin Luther King, saying, "We must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish as fools." That is not our democratic dilemma. We are not brothers. And yet, and we're never going to be. We are different, we are unequal. And how are we going to figure out how to give everybody unequal claim? So how am I going to alienate you in the appropriate way? You know, how am I going to give us all the kind of detachment from our current practices and assumptions so that we can see this democratic dilemma, the necessity constantly to think about the relationship between our individual interests and what can lay claim to us on us collectively? Well, I'm going to try to do that through the humanities, through a journey of increasing perception about the problems of our democracy and of what we might do about it, fueled by the humanities, in an attempt to put the humanities into practice. And it's my journey. So you might say, a selfie? Come on, isn't this exactly the sort of attitude you've just been criticizing? No. And this is implicit in the democratic dilemma as I've characterized it. We have no choice but to start with who we are. And a democracy has to recognize that. What do we care about? What can we see? What do we believe? And then connect it through the humanities in practice, suggesting to the bigger picture and other people's concerns. Oh, I forgot. So my journey of alienation began when I was a teenager, which I know this will amaze you, was in the 60s. And the fault line, the crack in our democratic facade, through which I could see there was a problem, was civil rights. A group clearly marginalized, nominally citizens, no say, right? And so my family used to drive by a bulletin board like this in Western Maryland, impugning the then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and being an incredibly self-important 14-year-old, I would say, one day that's going to say, impeach Cynthia Farrar. My plan was to go to college, to go to law school, and go pretty much directly to the Supreme Court. And we were going to fix this thing. So I went to college. I studied political science in the first instance, try and understand our institutions. And for those of you who are too old to know, this is a selfie stick. So you get enough distance. So hanging out with the framers and thinking about our institutions, what I came to realize was that our institutions don't actually deal with the democratic dilemma. They do what we so often tend to do. They try to erase it. So how, which they realize we have a problem. We have to reconcile this diverse country or, set of colonies, and we have to govern ourselves in a way that genuinely advances our collective good and lays legitimate claim on each of them. How do we solve for that? How do we square that circle? Well, the answer they gave was, we're going to have a filtration process, and that's the word they use. We're going to filter our various interests and our diverse perspectives and conditions through an elected elite, who we're going to authorize to achieve good government through reflection and so on. And in formulating this new vision of what they thought was the best possible form of self-government, that is representative government, Madison explicitly rejected what he understood to be the Athenian practice. He said, in ancient Athens, the people were somewhere. They gathered in the assembly, emerged from that gathering, were their decisions about what they ought to do collectively. And he said, our society, the people are not going to be somewhere. They're not going to be anywhere. They're going to be nowhere and everywhere. This filtration process. Now, I'm making this journey seem, as one does when looking back, seamless, and one thing led to another. It wasn't like that at all. But I did come to realize that this evasion of our democratic dilemma, handing off this filtration process was not going to get leverage on the kind of radical entrenched inequality that I was most concerned about. And perhaps even more damagingly, it masked the problem. So I went from thinking about institutions to thinking about democratic theory, doing the history of democratic thought, thinking that maybe I could find some principles that we could apply in revising our institutions so that they could address this democratic dilemma more effectively. And again, very roughly and simplifying drastically, it seemed to me they fell into two general categories. One group that, like poor Archimedes here, in order to get leverage, got way too far outside the world as we live it. That in order to try to solve for both inclusion and participation of a diverse community and legitimacy and good government, it laid the emphasis on the legitimacy and good government piece and engages us in a thought experiment that detaches us from our world as we live it and our differences. So imagine that there are no differences in power, there are no differences in condition or situation, and if we were like that, what could we all agree? What principles could we generate that would apply to each and every one of us? And that civic structure is characteristic of Kant, of Habermas, of John Rawls, and the problem is, okay, so let's generate principles. But what happens when we come to our senses and find ourselves actually, unequal and different? So the other folks privilege the other side of this dilemma, which is, well, let's genuinely reflect what people think are their interests, right? Let's not ask them to decide them. And let's aggregate and extrapolate from those to, what we all do. So these are all sorts of different kinds of theories. Some are market-driven or have that structure. Some are about interest-based pluralism, so different interests being expressed and being taken account of, and also theories that involve the competition of our leaders for election, and how does that enable us to express what we care about right now. Here too, right, but for a different reason, going to have a hard time getting outside the existing pattern of inequality that was of concern to me, because it wasn't asking us to do that at all. So we looked at institutions and ideas. I thought, well, let's look at those two together. Let's look at institutions and ideas in the context where they first arose, these democratic ideas, in ancient Athens. And of course it's dead, right? So I can pin it up like a butterfly on a corkboard and make it, reveal the secret of how they manage this. So starting in my senior year of college, and then when I went off to Cambridge, England to do my PhD, my first encounter with the Athenians, which was through their texts. The texts that were written in the period when they were institutionalizing democracy. And what I gleaned from them was, I'm afraid, all too readily assimilable to our practices, which is something we all do, right? But for me, because remember, I didn't just want to in the world, I wanted to change it, to paraphrase. So I needed something that I could actually apply when I came home to try to change democracy. So the framework I gleaned from my encounter with Athenian texts was about the relationship between leaders and the people, the demos. And of course, I hate this word, but nonetheless it applies here. The iconic instance of that is, of course, Pericles, as described in the great work by Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian War. And I thought, well, yeah, wow, you can have a really inclusive demos, populace that's really heard, and they can hold their leaders accountable. The leaders really do need to persuade them pretty much every day. And that process can nonetheless yield a wise and prudent leader. Not always, but it could. And a leader who was capable, in Thucydides' view, of also building the capacity of the citizens themselves in the process. Through his own wisdom, help them understand better what was at stake. So, believe it or not, they gave me a PhD. So I came back, as it happens, to New Haven, and in my second Athenian moment, I tried to practice Athenian. And so I took this framework of leaders and people, but a more inclusive people and a more accountable leadership or set of another. But apply it in a context that, I'm not naive. I knew that we didn't have any longer a kind of political framework that, where we could actually get leverage on the most powerful forces in the community, because those are actually social and economic forces. They're institutions. So what I did when I first came back to New Haven in a series of roles was what I think of as community organizing. So how do you get powerful institutions, the most powerful institutions, actually to attend, to respond to a broad group of the citizenry? And so I did that first at the Community Foundation in New Haven on the issue of improving the prospects for infants and children from minority and poor neighborhoods. Where the job was, I mean, I knew nothing about this, I also want to say. Talk about the humanities in work. I mean, yeah, well, I do ancient Athens. Of course I can do that job. But of course, the case I made was, well, I mean, I'm all about civic engagement. That's what I'm about, and that's what this is about. So how do we, you know, how do we corral the hospitals and the other service providers to be more responsive? Okay. And then I went to work for the university when it reoriented its relationship to New Haven. Same idea. How do we mobilize the neighborhoods to express themselves and get heard and taken account of in the plans the university was making? So I was not a bad orchestrator here. I mean, I was actually pretty good. And there were a lot of us working on it. And were those services better? Yes. Were those plans better? Yes. But the facts on the ground were not changed. You have two sets of interests here. A powerful set and a marginal set, and the marginal folks don't have any more leverage. And we haven't actually challenged anybody on either side of this equation to act as if they are citizens of the same community. We haven't built the capacity or a sense of shared identity. So I departed a little bit, and I should say that in this work kind of reflects the work of a whole lot of other innovators right now in this democracy field, scholars and practitioners, and the kinds of problems I ran into are problems for all of us. So so leaders and us within our existing framework, you know, with entrenched power, that's not going to help. So how can we actually build citizenship? How can we create an opportunity for a group that reflects who all of us are to get together and act like citizens, take each other into account, you know, consider their own interests in this bigger contest? What would come out? What would that mean for how we might operate as a democracy? So I did this in two ways. The first was, as Bonnie was saying, to organize citizen deliberations. Invite people randomly, the way you would for an opinion poll, give them a chance to talk to each other, pay them so that poor people can come, and then share the results of that deliberation about a highly contested issue with the larger public. And I did that in New Haven and then with PBS around the country. Okay? And then I thought, well, we could go to scale in a different way with this idea of conveying what we might actively do as citizens or think as citizens by using media, and especially now video online, to bring the voices of ordinary people from different backgrounds into the public discussion about the issue. And so I started Purple States to kind of try and give a civic structure to the digitally enabled conversation about our concerns. And I continue to do Purple States, and I will go on doing that. However, I had to realize that neither of these initiatives was actually getting a purchase on what the broader public thought or what decision makers thought. So, I mean, I could distill the demos, but it wasn't actually functioning as one. Right? So, back to the Athenians for the third time around, and this time looking at their practices, at their institutions. And I went back to the very beginning with Cleisthenes at the end of the 6th century. Because he understood that you can't just assume there's a demos. You actually have to create one. If you really mean a demos, a diverse group of people who mean to govern themselves, and you have to get past those kind of competing interests, entrenched and in different ways blind interests that I saw in community organizing, right? So how do we do that? And let me pause before my designated interrupter raises her hand. I just want to say, I know, as many of you do, of course, that the Athenians did not enfranchise women and that they had slaves. I think that nonetheless, we have a lot to learn from them, because what I'm going to try to show you over the remaining minutes of my talk is that the remarkable innovation, disruption that they came up with was designed precisely to get a broader group of people into a position where they could have an equal voice. And that can also be applied to other groups that they weren't. I would also like to say that, of course, that was characterized our own dear republic for the first 150 years of its life. Okay, that's my parenthesis. So back to Cleisthenes. So what did he do to create an actual demos, a public, the people? Well, one focus of his innovation was something really bizarre. Tribes. I mean, what could be better evidence that these guys were primitive and alien, not in a good alienating way that's going to enable us to refocus, just way too alien. But that is the whole point here. What he did was he turned a structure that was extra-political, that was based on 4 tribes, that was connected to clan and kinship relationships and hierarchies of various kinds. And this was in a period, I mean, the reason that this was both possible and necessary was because it was in a period when Athens had just gone through a time of an expansion of the demos, of the population, and in the population. And some uncertainty about who actually was an Athenian and who wasn't, and warring aristocrats. The advantage of certainty and polarizing the population, and in one case, Cleisthenes' rival, did call in Athens' mortal enemy, Sparta. Okay, so the place is crisis. So Cleisthenes reached out to this kind of altered, broader demos and made these changes. So what did he do? He created new tribes. He took the idea of affiliation and connectedness, characteristic of tribes, and he made it wholly and explicitly political. And they assigned membership of these tribes in the most impersonal way possible, by lot, by dividing up the area of Athens and allocating the different villages to the tribes by lot to create these 10 new tribes. Each of them was even given a hero. So it was kind of turning the idea that we have to create connectedness within our demos, but it has to be based not on existing connections or social or economic status or hierarchical relationships, but just on political status, period. And so being a member of a tribe now was how you served in the army, it was how you organized for civic festivals, and most importantly, it was how you participated in governance. This is how they moved from aristocracy to democracy, which is, I mean, that's really a remarkable move to have made. And it required this kind of radical disruption. So you then look at the way the Athenians institutionalized the practice of democracy over the succeeding decades and centuries. I mean, what they realized is what democracy requires is not one disruption, requires continual disruption. It requires continually us in our political role from other characteristics, from our social relationships, from our economic resources, from our, group identities, whatever. And we had to figure out if this demos was really going to be self-governing. We had to construct it in such a way that it could perform that role. And not just in the context that, for instance, Madison thought was defining of the Athenians, that is, making decisions in the assembly, what ought to happen, but no, in every context in which power is exercised. Every context. This is not a democracy in that sense of the term. They had to constitute versions of the demos, structure them so that they could perform this role in a way that had a on all of them. So I'm going to, for the last portion of my talk, I'm going to run through very quickly, enough to whet your appetite, I hope, how this system worked. And using a decree from almost 200 years after Cleisthenes, which established a new colony in the Adriatic. And the decree that survives is not the original decree, which is the first context of power, which is deciding what ought to happen. Yeah, build a colony. But the second one, which is the demos also has to decide, how do we do that? And so the place where those decisions are made is indeed the assembly. But notice, this is not all of the Athenians. Athens was about the size of New Haven. There were 30 to 40,000 citizens, depending on the time, okay? About 6,000 of them, give or take, would come to the assembly. But, so a subset, right? So why think that the gathering is the demos? Well, because it was entirely permeable. Anybody who was a citizen could come. Moreover, anybody who was a citizen could get up on the lectern, the bema, and make a proposal or comment on one. I mean, the great unsung hero of Athenian democracy is not a person. It's not Pericles. He's sung. Category, hobulamenos in Greek, which means he who wishes. And got up at the front of the assembly and said, anyone who wishes from among those who are eligible, that is citizens, can come up. Like Kaphisophon here. So, plausibly the demos. But how plausibly capable of effective and legitimate self-government? I mean, why think that this motley crew and their interaction was going to add up to anything like legitimate self-government? Well, people who came had been to a bunch of assemblies before. There were at least 40, at least at certain periods, every year. And they may well have served in different magistracies, which we'll talk about in a second. And they could learn from their fellow citizens as they got up on the bema and argued for or against a particular position. And they learned to regard a certain group of people who would regularly ascend the bema as notably all particular areas of policy experienced or just people who had good judgment. Moreover, they did not just gather and say, anybody have a good idea today? They structured, and this is, I mean, is a part of what I want to call your attention to. I mean, it's like a move contraption, and every move is there for a reason. So they had an agenda-setting body, the council, the boule, of 500 citizens. Now, why think that that subset is the demos? Well, because they are selected by lot, most impersonal method possible. So the fact that you had social standing entitled you to nothing, nor did the fact that you had none exclude you. Selected by lot, organized by tribe, already a mix, and rotated. At the end of every year, these guys go away, another set comes in, you could serve twice in your lifetime on the council. So, but in addition to preparing meeting agendas, the council served a role in the third area of context of power, which is actually implementing the decisions. Places where power is going to be exerted, or one group of interests is going to another. And so here, too, how do you constitute a demos that's capable of self-government? So the council itself served a role as the executive committee for the assembly. And within the council, there was an executive committee of the executive committee, which was organized by tribe. So plausibly the demos, and for the reasons I've just said, plausibly capable of doing their job competently. They also created scores of small boards that were delegated the task of carrying a particular function. So as here, the curators of the shipyards, there were 600 of these offices that were selected by lot every year. There were also another 100 that were elected. Election, which is a characteristic aristocratic form of selecting leaders. But 600 serving in boards of 10, and plausibly the demos, a board of 10, how? Selected by lot, organized by tribe, rotated. You couldn't serve more than once on any given board. So every citizen of Athens could say something that none of us can say, which is, that could be me. That could be me. So there's a kind of active continuity between we're carrying out particular roles and everything else, because indeed that could be you. And so they continually had to be thinking about what's the relationship between our individual interests and perspectives and abilities and the collective. And in the fourth area where power is exercised, accountability. How does the demos hold itself accountable? So here they created yet another structure, the juries. Every year, they would select by lot 6,000 from among those who presented themselves. They were paid, like the magistrates, at least like the assembly, so that you leveled differences in wealth for this purpose. So they organized juries, which did everything from here cases for civil and criminal cases to cases where there's some conflict about how a particular decree is being carried out, as here, and the triarchs are the captains of the warships. But up to and including challenges to decisions by the assembly. So the demos governs itself in assembly, but it also constitutes another subgroup to judge those decisions. And plausibly the demos, for the very reasons I was just saying about the jury, because these were juries. In addition to being selected by lot and paid, they were, they were experienced in other ways like the other bodies, but moreover, the cases were structured so that they heard both sides by secret ballot, and they actually had to swear an oath before they became a member of the jury pool to exercise fair judgment in accordance with the laws and so on. And then in the final area, how do you change this structure? How do you reflect on it? How do you see whether it's still serving your purposes? So sometimes, as here, that was as limited as creating a new administrative body where the assembly decided, yeah, we need to have one of those, and we're going to select these folks to by lot to perform this role. But in the 4th century, it also included revising the laws, changing the Constitution, as we would say. And that was a jury. So plausibly the demos and plausibly capable of legitimate self-government for the reasons I've already said. So what? Right? I mean, I hope this has been interesting. It's pretty remarkable what they did. But, we get on fine, right? We govern ourselves by opinion poll, the ballot box. We advocate our given bundle of interests and preferences and whatever. And, we get leaders. They happen to be from an elite and from a pretty predictable pool. why think that mapping this, our system, onto the ancients is of any value whatever? I mean, I've taken my trip with the humanities, assessed the value of what I've learned in practice, and then gone back to what the humanities can teach me and come back to practice. I mean, but so what? I mean, some people have accused me of, I didn't coin this phrase, I wish I had, of polis envy. Polis is the word for the Athenian polity, yeah. But no, at the very least, I would suggest to you that this journey has value as a critical tool. So what we can learn from the Athenians, I mean, at least two things. One is the so-called iron law of oligarchy, coined by Michaels, a political scientist, that always and everywhere elites will run things. No, it actually does not have to be that way. And believe me, the Athenians were not different from us in the sense that they were not better people. On the contrary, they were very aware, as a number of my colleagues here can tell you, incredibly aware of what a hard time we have as human beings getting along and being good, right? They were not better than us or different. So, iron law of oligarchy doesn't have to be that way. And secondly, you know, Winston Churchill said, the best argument against democracy is spending 5 minutes with the average voter. It doesn't have to be that way either. Citizens are not what Hillary Clinton now calls everyday people. They're stupid. We're not requiring anything of ourselves, right? Anyway, so negative lessons here, but maybe creative ones too. So worth considering, how does our situation relate to the situation, the crisis that led to the kind of disruptive innovation that Cleisthenes was able to bring about? Growing inequality, demographic diversity, leaders who seem to be locking horns in a feudal war with not much good in it for us from outside. Anyway, here's one thought. I mean, what's the smallest? I mean, for the innovators among us, and I think everyone here is in some way an entrepreneur. What's the smallest change we could make that would be adequately disruptive? That would be a kind of Cleisthenic move. So here's one thought, not awfully well thought through. Mandatory national service, and we're assigned to civic teams by lot. And we have to carry out the civic duty in the company of people we otherwise never hang out with, right? Anyway, could that kind of a move, could it actually lay the groundwork for a different kind of politics? But that's not really my job here. You know, that's our job collectively as citizens to figure out what we could do. My job is really to make you uneasy, right? Because uneasiness, I've suggested, is what democracy is all about. We can't just translate the personal into the political. We continually have to have institutions that, like the Athenians, continually required us to think about the relationship between our individual concerns, which matter, and our collective well-being. And I think the humanities are especially well placed to do that. The humanities not, as sometimes I hear them spoken of now, as a kind of mirror, like, wow, I'm so great, I'm just like X. Pericles, you know. But the humanities as an opportunity for reflection in the good sense, right? Distance, alienation, and reconnecting to what matters to us. So I will consider myself to have done my job here if I've learned understanding of the democratic dis-ease and to understand that it can't be cured. Thank you. So I'd be happy to to answer questions. Anybody? Yep, Cynthia.
I've got 1,000, I guess, questions or comments, but I'll try just a couple of easy ones. Okay, there's an Indian computer programmer that lives in my complex. He's an old friend of mine or whatnot. We talk about these things from time to time. And he thought that the reason why people don't, I guess, revolt or, make changes is because they're not hungry. And then, an industrialized nation like this one, that asymptote, we're far from it. But in Egypt, for example, the people were actually becoming hungry, so they took to the streets. He gave me that anecdote. So do you think that I guess, has a part to play in this? People are comfortable, they can feed themselves, so let's try that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I do think that the situation among the residents of Attica, the area of Athens, and particularly a group of people who are pretty close to the edge economically, and trying to figure out how they could be brought in to the demos. And I mean, we don't know a lot about this. Andrew's going to correct me. But it does seem like they were agitating for change. And indeed, the period just before Kleist was a period of tyranny at Athens, right? They'd gone from aristocracy to tyranny, which was in part, so we think, a power that was accumulated and consolidated through appealing to the people who were on the edge and needed to be considered now part of Athens. Their needs needed to be addressed. So yes, I think can that bring about political change? Yeah, but obviously we're not going to govern ourselves while continually hungry, right? So I mean, that's part of the challenge is how do we govern ourselves in such a way that everybody, whether they're hungry or not, is treated as having some really compelling claim on us. So I don't know if that gets to your question. I mean, another way of thinking about it might be hunger can bring about revolution. But then, what do we do to actually govern ourselves differently? I mean, if you look at Egypt right now, you got to ask. I mean, it seems like they've reverted to some pretty standard patterns. So, yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that because one of the neat things that you mentioned with Cleisthenes is, of course, there was this agitation at the time, and they seemed to want to have a political solution. Mm-hmm. So he was responding to that need. Mm-hmm. But are we in a situation like that where that the political solution is a possible answer, or is there, like, for example, you mentioned in San Francisco, it seemed like the sides don't see politics as the solution, right, but as part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Have we become too disenchanted with the political process?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to know how to get right, under our different circumstances. But I mean, I was talking to some graduate students today, and I think one of the problems we've got that I for sure had in New Haven and that the Economist article is trying to capture is that our political boundaries don't reflect the scope of social and economic power anymore, right? So how do people even, and it's true of those folks in San Francisco, right? I mean, the rich people can go wherever they like, the less rich people are stuck, but we have a mobile. We now are, all of us really, really mobile. We can make our choices to affiliate just with people who are like us, and still to work where we want to work, but we don't have to be part of the same polity. So I think that's where I see the problem of getting leverage is it's not even, it is partly that we don't trust our politicians anymore, but that might help me, right? I mean, yeah, that system is broken. And now we know from the internet and all sorts of and various social movements that actually we have a lot to say for ourselves. So what would it take to create a system that had a boundary that everybody would then feel they had a commitment to? I mean, that's where I see the biggest problem. So what is that? What is that context, you know? It's almost certainly not the neighborhood or the town, which is what I used to think. I don't know how many of you know the work of Hannah Arendt, but there are also lots of others, and many of these innovators that I'm talking about, we are all doing work at the local level. But it's just very hard to get leverage on power at that level. It's very hard. So what is that? What is that boundary? I don't have an easy answer. And clearly it needs to be adapted to our own context. It can't just be, hauled out of mothballs and applied to us. And it may be that experiments at the local level, that's certainly my hope, or experiments in the media can actually at least begin to change our expectations of ourselves as citizens and our leaders' sort of expectations of us. I mean, after I held one of these citizen deliberations in the greater New Haven area, I had the participants meet with the mayors of their towns. And a part of what I was trying to do was to get the region in the room. In Connecticut, the region has no political identity. We have no counties, so every municipality is its own thing. But of course, people don't just work within and live within a particular town. So I got all the municipalities together and randomly. But anyway, the mayor of New Haven calls me the next day, which he was not in the habit of doing, and he said, you know what was so amazing about those people? And they'd had one day of deliberating with each other. He said, usually I only hear from citizens when I'm about to, take their house, close their school, raise their taxes, something that impinges directly on their immediate interest. Here's a bunch of folks who were talking about, I can't remember what the issue was that year, what we should be investing in child development. I mean, I don't know. Or indeed how we organize our funding for education. And they were fluent in this, and they were passionate about it, and I couldn't have told you who was from New Haven, which is the poorest place, and who was from Woodbridge, which is the richest place. So it may be that those kinds of local experiments can help to change the context. But the true answer is, I know where the problems lie, I think, but I don't know what the answers are. Yeah.
Just to go on Dr. Wolper's question here. I remember a statistic a couple of years ago that it was over half of Americans asked couldn't name the three branches of government, mm-hmm. And over
so
half.
So they won't miss them.
Exactly. And over half didn't pass the citizenship test that are given to people when they take the citizenship test. And speaking with some of my friends, sometimes when they don't particularly like what the president does, they'll talk about how, the president writes laws or something like that, which of course is ridiculous because the lobbyists write laws. So I'm just curious, when you say Hillary Clinton talks about everyday people, this demagoguery trying to beef up the national spirit of, hey, you're smart, you know what you're talking about, we need your vote. How much of this is just dependent upon people being completely uninformed about these kind of things?
Yeah, I don't challenge that.
Okay.
I think part of what I believe is our system sets us up to be, our system functions on ignorance and apathy of the people. And there have been all sorts of political scientists through the years who have thought that is just dandy. Yeah, that's what we want. And yes, so are we that way? Yes, we are. And is that kind of appeal to us individually? I was trying to say earlier, yeah, that we're being appealed to as consumers. Right?
So how then do you come to a political solution when a large portion of the population doesn't recognize it even as a political problem like he has?
Well, they recognize there's a problem, don't you think? Increasingly, people think there's a problem. I'm asking. I mean, this is an empirical question, right? I mean, whether there's the ground is fallow for this right now, I don't know. But I think a lot of people, I mean, it's one reason we are so suspicious of our elected leaders is because they pander to us. We know that. I mean, they think we're stupid. I mean, really stupid. So I think there's a certain level of awareness of that. But, you're really onto something because in, the way I think about it, you can't just play around here. You have to have a major disruption. You really have to change the terms because you can't get a group of citizens together for a one-day deliberation, however jazzed they are and however able they are to detach themselves from, and say, yes, now we're on our way. This has to happen. It has to happen all the time. It has to happen regularly. They have to have real power. So I tried for a while to institutionalize these citizen deliberations in New Haven, right? And to actually persuade the mayor to give the folks some authority. And there are efforts now. I don't know how many of you know about participatory budgeting, but there are a variety of efforts to try to make some of this connect to our institutions in such a way that people feel when they come they're actually influencing what happens. But it's going to take, in a way, we have to do everything in order to do anything, because you have to change the way people feel about themselves as citizens. You have to make them feel like what they say matters. You have to give them a chance to learn, a chance to engage, a chance to, So it's very hard to see how, given the current situation, how we can get to the next step. Yeah, it would take a radical move. Yep.
Thanks. So in the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides, I believe, has Pericles say that the person who doesn't make the business of Athens his business has no business being in Athens.
Roughly.
But
yeah.
one suspects that even back then it was a bit of a hard sell, which is to say people had better things to do.
Mm-hmm.
And today it's a particularly hard sell because there's so many more things to do. Compare what it's like to watch C-SPAN versus any of the other diversions we have.
Sure.
And in some sense, that's a problem with shared governance in universities, too. We have other things to do. So I'm sitting a couple chairs next to my chair, who gratefully makes all sorts of decisions. And I'm happy that he has to spend the time doing that rather than me.
Right.
And I don't want to be involved in all that deliberation that he has to go through. Of course, when he makes decisions I'm not happy with, I also complain and bitch and I let him know, and he has to listen, which is called, at some level, responsible government.
Yeah.
So this is a long-winded way of saying, is the problem really that we need more time spent in deliberation, which not many people really want to do, or is the problem that we need more responsible government?
Okay. Well, I mean, I would say, okay, how do we get the more responsible government? But so here's the thing. So the Greek word for what we would call a private citizen, somebody who doesn't participate, is an idiot. Literally, it's an idiotes. It's an idiot. Okay. But the fact is, they never made this mandatory, ever. I mean, it's mandatory for us to serve on juries. They never made any of this mandatory. And the fact that they talk so much about the people who don't participate, the apragmon, the sort of, the people who are not involved in the life of the polis. And they also talk about the real busybodies, the people who do nothing but that. Suggests that actually, yeah, sure, some people really like to do it. And the process of participating actually builds that. So in a way, it's the same question. I mean, when I saw these people after getting a chance to engage with each other, they were so jazzed, and they'd have been even more so if they'd actually had an impact on what happened. But remember, they rotated. They were paid. And, nobody had to do this. So maybe they were different from us, but I happen to think that it was actually the structure that made them made them really participate. But then I would throw the question back to you, if we really if the alternative really is responsible government, how do we get that in our system?
Well, there's any number of means to take cracks at it. Some of it has to do with getting some of the big money out of politics, so politicians are actually more responsible to the people that elect them rather than the moneyed interests. There's 101 different ways of approaching it,
right.
But it's not necessarily to say we need more people deliberating more of the time.
Yeah, but I mean, part of the case I'm trying to make is you can create a really small subset of the people, and they can function as the people, as long as it's within. So it's not everybody. It's not like the entire demos has to gather in assembly 40 times a year. They precisely did not. And the boards that made the decisions in the context of a dean, an administrative role, right? Those were boards of 10. But notice this, they weren't elected, right? I mean, neither is your dean. Appointed, presumably, by some other power. But see, the thing that nobody talks about is that election is our way of saying we have power, equal power. What makes us capable of carrying out that role? What? I mean, especially if, as you were suggesting, we're all, we're not only treated like we have no clue, but increasingly, and as you're saying, in a culture in which we have lots of other things we can do, we're not participating. But I mean, so then what makes us good voters? What? So I just, I think electoral democracy, there's just a fundamental problem about, which is the problem I was trying to identify between equal say and, legitimate self-government. I mean, how do we do that?
Hi. So you mentioned the money issue just came up, and you have mentioned it a couple of times in your speech. Would you mind talking a little bit about how the Athenians might have conceptualized how money might have gotten in the way of their democracy and their politics? We have a very contemporary understanding. I was curious if there were any parallels.
Yeah. So actually, I had to cut out. Oh, there we go. No. So they invented machinery to make this work. I mean, quite literally. This is the lottery machine. Okay. So huge difference in wealth in the Athenian democracy, and contrary to the belief of belief that has persisted over the centuries, this was no socialist utopia, if that is a utopia. They did not equalize wealth. And so that's my conundrum, right? Everybody remains unequal. Everybody remains unequal, and yet they function together with an equal say. How do you do that? And they were constantly struggling against it. Now, the lot is one way to do that. Because election, as the founders well knew, will result in the choice of people who have reputation, who have, education, who have all sorts of privileges, including very often wealth, right? That's what election does. We pick prominent people. We're prominent for some reason, right? So the lot is one answer, very important. And yet they did elect some people. But they also made sure that the wealthy people were happy. And the way they did that was they gave all sorts of honors and recognition and important roles, but ones that were actually contributed to the well-being of the democracy. So affluent people in Athens had to equip and captain the warships. They also had to pay for the production of drama, comedy, tragedy, whatever. They had to do that. But this was a huge honor for them, and it satisfied their desire for prominence and distinction and recognition and all that kind of thing. and they also paid some taxes. But, part of the compact here was that the people who, in principle, could have gathered in the assembly and had the numbers, that they were not going to simply soak the rich. They were not just going to appropriate the wealth of the rich. That was part of the kind of tacit agreement. But they did everything they could think of to prevent wealth from exercising influence over what happened. And they didn't always succeed, that's for sure. But that's why they had to go to such strenuous lengths. Sophia, yes.
If I can ask a question.
Of course.
It's a hypothetical question. Let's say the ancient Athenians had social media. I don't know, aliens come, they give them fiber optic cables, I'm not sure of the details, but they have social media. Do you think there's any way the ancient Athenians in this model could have employed social media to enhance their democracy?
Okay, well, see, part of one virtue of the Athenian democracy is that they achieved full representation not by giving voice to specific groups, like, okay, you over here who've been disfranchised, now you're going to have a voice as a group. What they did was to involve every individual, in a way, whether they participated actively or not, in this larger kind of interaction tension between what's the relationship between individual interests and our collective interests, right? So, I mean, social media sometimes now is used for the purpose that I was talking about earlier, about the erosion of our political framework from below, right? Nonprofits and the web is a way for us to affiliate by our shared identity sometimes, interests, ideology, right? And then to make ourselves felt. But I think what is really important, and it was a feature. I mean, it was one reason why I created Purple State, is they understood the importance of publicity and transparency. I mean, they understood it really well. Anybody could go and consult the decrees in the archive, and and all the decrees were posted in the central civic space. Anybody could go look at them. Anybody who couldn't read could get somebody else in their tribe to read it for them. So publicity, I mean, what we would think of as media was really crucial. But I think the question here is, what about one-to-one and one-to-many media that doesn't require us to have that conversation? I think that's right. That's the problem, and it's a problem as I see it, and especially if it makes us think that somehow we're being heard, but yet we're not being asked to connect with the concerns of others who may be, following a different Facebook group for a different advocacy organization or ideology or whatever. But I think there's a lot of work to do there, and there's a huge amount of potential. It's just that we must not think that we've solved our problem, because we now have these tools at our disposal, and that all our concerns and our activities and everything, we can publicize them and we can make them available to everybody. That's just not a solution. We need a structure, and we can't expect it to be just a structure that surfaces on its own. It's not going to happen. We have to think about what kind of structure, and it has to be a political one. It can't be a social one, because it can't just be a reflection of. Yeah.
So there's a book called Lights in the Tunnel, and they talk about technological unemployment, driving it up to, 50, 60, 70%, in the next 20 or 30 years.
Where?
So unemployment.
Where?
Worldwide.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so your mundane jobs will be, taken over by, robots or whatnot. So that would make hungry people. I mean, if, the robots are doing all the work, and at that point, either you put the people on the subsidy because they were, robots, took their jobs, or you got to kill them off or whatnot. So do you think that maybe that is an event that could would bring about this change that you talk about? Because, if you got, a third-year society, homeless, not homeless, but like no job, no subsidy because the robots took the jobs,
Right.
Would that be the impetus maybe?
Well, I think it's a deep and important question, and some political scientists are raising it about, we have, in principle, we have a democracy, right? So just to talk about us for the moment, why don't the people who have nothing but a vote and are hungry, or dispossessed in some way, why don't they all get together and vote to, give some large portion of what, the rich and powerful people have, take it. And, I mean, you might say, well, we don't actually have a democracy, so that's one reason. But I also think that in this country anyway, we all tend to think that we could be rich, right? Like, just give me enough time. And in a way, although I am an entrepreneur, the entrepreneurial creed kind of feeds into this, right? So it's like, I'm hungry today, but I shouldn't engage in revolution because actually this is a system in which I could be Bill Gates next week, right? And that, of course, feeds into the status quo completely.
Yeah, I guess the stats go on moving from the bottom quintile to the top. They're on the internet now, so I guess,
Oh, yeah.
It's terrible.
That is terrible. And yet, a lot of folks still believe. I mean, most people now believe that's getting a lot worse. That has gotten through. But, yeah. So again, I think that might drive revolution, but I think it's going to require real structural innovation to then commit to real democratic practice that makes everybody, a part of.
Yeah, I mean, we would have to because the people would die. I mean, if something wasn't done politically to change,
Yeah. Well, and I'm suggesting we may need a crisis in order to move to a different kind of a system. Yeah. Yep.
I liked your comment about universal military service.
I didn't actually say military.
Oh, I thought that's what you meant.
I think it would include military, but it could be national service of various kinds. Yep.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think if we look back to the last time we had a draft, there was a great deal of public deliberation in many public
and protest.
I mean, so I personally think that's a revolutionary change that we need, and I think that politicians who are in power are very aware of the effect of universal military service, that will immediately engage a large number of people in the most important issues that face our society. And
Yep. People across difference, that is for sure.
Right.
Well, there's a big debate about Athenian democracy, about whether the reason that Athenian democracy perhaps not started but was able to continue as long as it did was because they needed the people who rowed the ships. And the people who rowed the ships were not people who needed to have property. Traditionally, when a polis went to war, it was the people who could afford armor, or a horse even, who fought the wars. And so therefore they were in some sense entitled to greater authority, right? But when the Athenians turned to the sea as the basis of their power, there were all these rowers who came from the lower elements in the everyday people. And so then you depend on them. So, I mean, I think that too, that kind of consideration also argues, how do you start to see people as fully a member and carrying some really important piece of what matters to this country. Yep. Right behind you.
I
I'm afraid that we'll have to cut this to a close now, but I'm sure that Cynthia...
So can I ask you to do one thing? Let's just hear their questions. Can we hear their questions? And then I don't have to answer, but we at least get them to, yeah. Thank you, Cynthia.
I'm very sympathetic to thinking about democracy in terms of a logical space and a structure, and rather than thinking of it like in the personal as political and identity. I'm familiar with some of the literature. I'm thinking in particular a philosopher named Christian List from the London School of Economics, who wrote a paper, I believe, a couple of years ago, where he identified something called the democratic trilemma. Which,
The democratic?
Trilemma, which you may or may not be familiar with. And he basically said that we think of...
No, I know him, but
Yeah.
I don't know him.
We think of democracy in like terms of robustness of pluralism, where we recognize people's individual attitudes, and then basic majoritarianism, majority rule, and then collective rationality, where there's consistency among the kinds of decisions that are made. And he basically argues that any democracy will be compromised because only two of those properties can actually cohere. They can't all three exist at the same time. So you'll always end up with some kind of compromised democracy, even in terms of structure. So I was wondering if you might have thoughts on that.
Well, I don't have to answer, but I can answer. I can answer later. I'll answer later. Yeah.
In the spirit of unease, any other questions that anyone would like to leave us with?
Here.
Kind of the elephant in the room here is that the Athenian government was disrupted several times by oligarchy. Is Athens necessarily, and the greater involvement of the population, necessarily a stabilizing factor in Athenian history? And is it something that we want to adopt into our own society at this time when we have a very stable government and a flourishing economy?
Yeah, no, they for sure, they experienced oligarchic upheaval, revolution. It was influenced in part by what was happening in the war and by attempts to engage Sparta in trying to bring peace and, all of that kind of stuff, yeah. And they did recognize that there were some issues, and so that was the major, I'm answering. What am I doing? Okay, to be continued.
This is a question also that we continue for tomorrow, but I wonder where in this whole picture immigrants fit, i.e. the people with an accent, i.e. the people who have no vote or have to wait for 15 years to get one.
Yep.
And that also in the Athenian context. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much.
Other questions?